Got to the point where George Bush called the work disgraceful, which I'm like, what? The President of the United States knows I exist? And he doesn't like what I'm doing? Well, right on to that. This is a great job. I want to do this for the rest of my life.
Good evening, everyone. I am Jonna Gifford. I am the Chief of Adult Library Services here at Boston Public Library. Thrilled that you're here to spend the evening with us. Thank you. Welcome back to the Central Library if you haven't been, or welcome to the library if you haven't been. So this is an exciting program tonight, ladies and gentlemen. In 2025, we have organized our programming around the theme of revolutionary art. So last year, we did programs on revolutionary music. This year, revolutionary art, and it's our way of marching towards the anniversary, the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. So what we're doing this year is an exciting mix of programs, exhibitions, and highlights from our collections. Revolutionary art is exploring how art sparks transformation, celebrates creativity, and influences the future. From visual arts and performances to discussions and displays, this series honors art's power to drive social progress. As I said, as we begin the celebration of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, we have been exploring ideas in our programming around protest and liberty and freedom and social change. How do these themes resonate in our modern society today, as well as in our history as a nation? And where is the place of art as catalyst and witness and memory? Let us also recognize that tomorrow is the Juneteenth holiday, a day to commemorate the emancipation of enslaved Black Americans, marking the day when news of freedom finally reached the last of the enslaved people in Galveston, Texas on June 19th, 1865. It's a pleasure to gather tonight with all of you on the eve of Juneteenth for this program. We think our guest this evening is the perfect person to lead us in conversation about all of these ideas. Dred Scott is an interdisciplinary artist who for 4 decades has made work that encourages viewers to re-examine cohering ideals of American society. In 1989, the US Senate outlawed his artwork, and President Bush declared it disgraceful because of its transgressive use of the American flag. Dred became part of a landmark Supreme Court case when he and others burned flags on the steps of the Capitol. He has presented a TED Talk on this subject that I encourage you all to watch later. His work asks viewers to look soberly at America's past and our present. Writing about his art in the New York Times, Angelica Rogers wrote, quote, "It was difficult to look away from the flag's blocky capitalized type. A man was lynched by police today. It shouted the words so matter-of-factly that I felt myself physically flinch," unquote. Dred works in a range of media, from performance and photography to screen printing and video. He is an academician at the National Academy of Design and has received an honorary doctorate from the Pratt Institute. Our moderator tonight, Dr. Lizzie Cooper Davis, is an associate professor and graduate program director at Emerson College. She is an artist and scholar interested in how the arts can facilitate community conversation, resistance, and change. She is particularly focused on cultural work within Black freedom movements and has conducted research in such places as Cuba, Brazil, and New Orleans. Lizzie is currently developing an applied theater project engaging people returning home from incarceration and their communities in partnership with Ritual for Return, Emerson Prison Initiative, and New Beginnings Reentry Services. Her bio goes on and on and on. It's really fascinating. I'm going to stop there because I know these introductions can get very long. So I encourage you to look her up and read more about her academic work and her work as an actor and an artist. But we're thrilled that she has joined us tonight to be in conversation with Dred Scott. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. Please welcome Dred Scott and Dr. Lizzie Cooper Davis to the stage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Stephen Colbert does that, and I guess he's got more practice. It's like right on cue for it. So it's going to be a little awkward because Lizzie's sitting on stage, and I'm going to talk at you for about 10 minutes and show some pictures. And so, it's just a little weird for her sitting down there and me here, but, that's what it is. The reason I'm going to show some images is because, as you heard, I'm a visual artist, but I work in a lot of media, and I assume that some of you don't know my practice pretty well. Or very well. And so a lot of times when people hear, oh, you're a visual artist, they think, oh, he's a painter or something like that. And I do some of that, or he does drawings or sculptures. But the way I work is actually pretty varied. And so I want, I tell people I make revolutionary art to propel history forward. And that can be in screen printing, it can be in photography, it can be in performance, it can be public work. And so I'm just going to do a very quick overview for about 10 minutes to show probably about 8 projects. And then Lizzie and I will have a conversation that might touch on some of the work I show, but also some other things. And so I just am telling you a bit of a roadmap so that when I'm going really quickly, you're like, no, I want to talk more about that. It's okay, because we're going to actually have some time to talk. Let's see. This is, work that looks kind of like painting or something. It's actually a body print and screen print on canvas that was made a couple years ago. It's about 7 feet tall by about 4 feet. And I'm really, as I said, not going to talk that much about some of these. I'm just going to give a quick overview because this is work that looks like, artwork in a gallery and museum, as is this. These were both from a project about Nina Simone. This actually is inspired by her song Pirate Jenny. And this is also, looks kind of like art, looks like a painting. This is a screen print. And it's a project called Obliterated Power Capitol. And this is Obliterated Power Supreme Court. And these are about 40 inches wide by about 27 inches tall from about 2 years ago. And this is not my work, but I show this to show something that a project that actually was talked about just recently, where it says, hey, he talked about the block letters, almost made me flinch. This is an image of a flag that the NAACP, a civil rights organization, used to hang outside of their window the day after anybody was lynched. It was at their national headquarters in New York that they did this from 1920 to 1938. And a lot of my work looks at history, and I use and deploy history to talk about our present, and also the connection between how the past both sets the stage for the present, but also how it resides in the present in new form. And so this project in the civil rights space was actually really important, and it was part of what they called an anti-lynching campaign. But what does it mean that you need an anti-lynching campaign? And so I knew that at the height of lynching, the figures, there were about 1,700 people killed in a decade by the police. Well, currently the police kill about 1,100 people a year. So it's about 5 times the rate as were killed during the height of lynching. And so I updated this project. And this was taking this work from an activist space, putting it out in front of an art gallery. But then my work, gets taken up in various forms. And so this was in front of the Jack Shainman Gallery in New York. But then it gets onto the front page in the NewYorkTimes.com. So a lot of people see my work in that context. And then from that context, it goes into the Whitney Museum. And so my work shows on street corners, my work shows in museums, my work shows in galleries. And that different context, I value all of those audiences, and it's all important. This is what is the proper way to display a US flag, and I will show you a detail of the photo montage in a second. But for right now, know that there's a photo montage at the top that has the text that's the title of the work, what is the proper way to display a US flag. Below that are books on shelves that were originally blank that people could write responses to that question. And below that is a 3x5 foot American flag that people had the option of standing on as they wrote their responses. This is a detail of the photo montage, and it shows South Korean students burning American flags, holding signs saying, "Yankee, go home, son of a bitch." And below that are coffins coming back from Vietnam and a troop transport draped in the American flag. This is somebody standing next to the work, interacting with it, and this is somebody standing, or people standing on the work, on the flag. And so either is fine, but the point is that people have the choice to do what they want. And they wrote lots of different things. Sometimes they wrote really long things, as you see on the right-hand page, it's a whole page. On the left-hand page, you see somebody just writes a sentence. Sometimes people wrote really short things, "on a pole." And then sometimes they drew things like American flag toilet paper, And people wrote in lots of different languages. And then one person wrote, "I'm a German girl. If we Germans would admire our flag as you all do, we would be called Nazis again. I think you do have too much trouble about this flag." You're fucked. Minorities get everything. In Russia, you would be shot and your family would have to pay for the bullets. But once again, what do you expect from a nigger named Dred Scott? The flag I'm standing on stands for everything oppressive in this system, the murder of the Indians and all the oppressed around the world, including my brother who was shot by a pig who kicked over his body to, quote, "make sure the nigger was dead," unquote. The pig was wearing the flag. Thank you, Dred Scott, for this opportunity. So this was a project that really involved audience participation. That was at the heart of the project. The audience, when a lot of people say, "What's your medium?" You work in oil on canvas or silk screen on paper. Well, one of the elements of this artwork was an active audience. The audience was actually part of the medium for the work, and their ideas were central and important to the project. And so it's not just my thoughts on the flag, but it's actually engaging in a dialogue. And as you can see, people had lots of different passionate views. This is one of the passionate views. This was a demonstration of 2,500 reactionary veterans, almost all white, almost all from World War II and the Korean War. The Vietnam vets weren't there, and they were demonstrating in front of the Art Institute of Chicago, which was physically and in other ways attached to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I was an undergraduate student at the time. And they chanted things like, "The flag and the artist, hang them both high," evoking images of lynching. Got to the point where George Bush called the work disgraceful, which I'm like, what? The President of the United States knows I exist? And he doesn't like what I'm doing? Well, right on to that. This is a great job. I want to do this for the rest of my life. And then it got to the point where Congress outlawed the work, which, I don't have time to talk all about that. I knew this was a significant event, that here is this relatively unknown artist at a Midwestern art school that is having their work outlawed, effectively tearing up the First Amendment to suppress particular views and try and enforce one explicit view of the flag as being permissible and outlawing and banning all others. It was about a lot more than my artwork. It wasn't just about this, but I will say that this was trying to make patriotism mandatory and compulsory. And so what does one do when one's confronted by an unjust law? One defies that law. So this is me burning flags on the steps of the US Capitol. There were 3 other people that did it, including Dave Blaylock, who was a Vietnam veteran, Joey Johnson, who had a previous case go to the Supreme Court for flag burning, and Sean Eichmann, another revolutionary artist. But I was the good-looking one. So I had the photo op. And so it became a Supreme Court case, United States versus America versus Sean Eichmann et al. I was part of et al., fancy word for and others. And so now you guys can do whatever you want with the flag. You can wear it as a flag lapel pin. You can fly it proudly on the 4th of July. You can burn it. You can blow your nose in it. You can wipe your butt with it. You can make art with it. Moving on. Slave rebellion reenactment was a reenactment of the largest rebellion of enslaved people in the history of the United States. So some of the work I'd shown you previously is mostly work in galleries and museums, although a man was lynched by police yesterday also was sort of outside. This was a community engaged project that had 350 reenactors that marched for the course of 2 days on the outskirts of New Orleans, in the suburbs and exurbs, and then into the city itself. It was an amazing spectacle if you happen to be going home from work or coming shopping or something to see 350 Black and Indigenous people reenacting the largest rebellion of enslaved people, which originally happened in 1811. People carrying muskets and machetes, chanting, "On to New Orleans, freedom or death, we're going to end slavery, join us." We marched from a town called La Place down to a town called Kenner, which is, if you guys know New Orleans, it's near where the airport is. So we marched down the Mississippi River and past towns like Norco and New Sarpy. But largely it was a community engaged project. It involved me talking with the community and both getting permission to do the work, but recruiting them to participate in it, because I'm not from New Orleans, I live in New York. And so I wanted to get the sign off of people who lived in the area to deploy and engage their history. So we had sewing circles to actually meet people. A lot of times people were sewing their own costumes. They learned to sew the day before or that day. And sometimes people made costumes for other people. We had to design flags because even though we knew that there were the size of the army and that they were carrying flags, there was no description in the historic record of what those flags were, so we had to make them up. Again, for time, I'm not going to talk about what they were so much, and here are just some performance stills of what an audience would see if they were stumbling across this work or coming explicitly to see it. And as you can see, there's a lot of modern day in this. I mean, when a lot of times people think of reenactment, they try and a lot of reenactors try and sort of transport the audience back in time to this is exactly how it would have been in 1863. And so they try and get to a field, like if they're doing the Battle of Gettysburg, Civil War reenactment is the main form of reenactment in the United States. And so a lot of times they'll try and go to a bucolic field and get, you know, the troop movements and everything exactly right, the costumes exactly right. But they get the main question of the Civil War wrong. And they're really interested in sort of telling their interpretation of that history, which, you know, is at best brother fighting brother. At worst, it's a terrible war, the War of Northern Aggression, where the valiant and gallant South was repressed by the evil North, because it really is a Southern tradition. Anyway, I'm interested in the social questions of slave rebellions and how the past collides with the present. So I brought, instead of taking the audience back in time, I brought the army of the enslaved from the past to collide with our present. And so the fact that there is this major oil refinery or train trestles or cars in the background is very intentional. It's not because I couldn't afford to find a field where it could be exited. I wanted this army of the enslaved to clash with this petrochemical plant, which is actually poisoning the descendants of enslaved people and literally placed on top of the graves of enslaved people. And this is just what it sort of would sound like if you were coming out for your Saturday morning or Sunday morning coffee in the region where we reenacted it.
On to New Orleans! Freedom or death! We're gonna end slavery! Join us! Join us! Freedom! 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 Freedom!
And this was not a project about slavery. It was a project about Black joy, about liberation, and about freedom. And the work, again, this was in public, but it also then gets taken back into museums and gallery spaces as large-scale performance stills. And this is just a shot of Venice because I did a project in last year's Venice Biennale, the Venice Biennial. I did a project called the All African Peoples Consulate, which created a real functioning consulate, or like an embassy, for an imaginary Pan-African Afrofuturist union of countries. So it was a real functioning consulate for a place that didn't exist in a time that didn't exist. Like all consulates, we offer passports and visas. Passports were available to anybody who was African, meaning they were a citizen of one of the 54 countries of Africa, regardless of their ethnicity. Or if they were Afro-descendant living anywhere on the planet, they could qualify for a passport. If they didn't meet that criteria, they could qualify for a visa. It was an office space, so you'd come in and you would, make an appointment. You would talk with our consular officers, and they would interview you. If you qualified for a passport, you would have your picture taken, and you would have a passport that would have your picture in it and would be personalized. It would look just like a real passport. The passports sort of would tell the story of the country, or in this case, union of countries that it was for. And these are some people happy to have received their passports. And I'm just going to show you two other works to so you'll have a background and we can have a good conversation. One is this is a project from 2007. It's just Imagine a World Without America, and it's not a project about geography, just filling in. But you know, often when people from America see a global map, America's at the center, and in this case, America's kind of pushed off to the side. You get Africa, you get Africa and Europe in the center, but you get Alaska and Florida and Maine. The Midwest kind of gets cut out, and so does Canada. And if there are any Canadians in the audience, I apologize for cutting out your country, but it's kind of your fault for moving so close to America anyway. So, but this is a good thought experiment that I encourage you all to do. And I will end with one last work that's a user agreement. And so by reading this, you agree to overthrow dictators. Now that you've all read that, this is what you've agreed to. And it's really relevant now. This is a conceptual artwork. It is text-based. It exists in lots of different forms. It exists in this form, which is a laser-cut stencil. It exists as spray paint using a stencil. It exists as the signature on my email sometimes. It exists in whatever form you want to take it. You want to make it the signature of your email, you could do that. You know, it is conceptual text. It's open source, and it's really relevant for these times. So I will leave it at that and shut my laptop and go have a conversation with Lizzie. So, yes.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, too. I told you this last week when we had our prep call, but if anyone had asked me what artist I would most want to talk to right now, I very well may have said Trescott. And all the better, of course, to do so on Juneteenth Eve, right? As your work is really pushing us to consider freedom, power, explore what it takes to imagine freedom, to fight for freedom, to practice freedom, to claim freedom. And within the particular context of the United States, I have a Juneteenth shirt, which I'll probably wear tomorrow. It says Juneteenth free-ish since 1863.
Okay.
Right? And I feel like your work is really like, let's look at that ish.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? What's going on here? So I wonder if you could start us off by talking a bit about how the arts became your language for this kind of work, your method of engagement. Dr. Bernice Johnson Regan, I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she was, among many other things, an organizer with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and a co-founder of the Freedom Singers in the Civil Rights Movement. And she often said the songs of the movement were like an instrument, like holding a tool in your hand. And I feel like you're using the arts in a similar way. So I'm curious, how did the arts become your tool? How did you pick up that tool?
Well, somewhat by accident. So the short version of the story is I was a terrible student in high school and became an artist. The more nuanced version is that I thought I was going to be a scientist or chemical engineer, computer engineer, physicist or something. And I went to this elite private high school for 12 years, first grade through 11th grade twice. And apparently MIT or Caltech would prefer people to have graduated with good grades in order to go there. And so that wasn't going to be possible. I probably could have actually gone into a good state school or something, but I didn't know that because when you're 18, you're kind of stupid and you just think, oh, well, I've closed that career option down. And so my parents said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'll become a photographer. And the reason I said that was I grew up around cameras. My dad, before I was born, was a professional photographer. He'd given that up for a range of reasons by the time I was born, but he stayed as a serious amateur. And so I grew up around cameras and I liked it. But again, you're 18, you don't really know much of anything. I didn't really know what photographers did. I knew they took pictures and somebody said, hey, take some classes at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And I go, oh, you mean that boring place that has those lions out in front? Like, yeah, dummy, they'll teach you to be a photographer. Like, okay. So I went to the School of the Art Institute, and they didn't care that I did badly in high school. And they didn't even ask whether I graduated, and I didn't bother to volunteer telling them that I hadn't. And so I ended up there, and I fell in love with art. I mean, I knew a little bit about art before I got there, but I really didn't. And they treated me kind of like an adult, which in all fairness, probably any university would have. But I didn't know that. I just knew, well, they treat me pretty good, and they asked me questions and treat me like I got a brain. And I just lived in the darkroom and sucked up all their art history classes. And so that's how I became an artist. But the question of why am I using art to do this is I grew up in Ronald Reagan's America. Ronald Reagan made me a communist. It probably wasn't personally about me, but it was pretty monstrous and it was just terrible. If you didn't get along with the narrow-minded selfishness and greed and America first that he represented, you didn't fit in very well in that society. And I didn't fit in. And so I was looking for how to rebel against it, both through activism and through art. And I discovered music, both punk rock, but then hip hop, that was sort of fighting the power, and checking out literature, Toni Morrison and people like that were actually trying to talk about the world that we lived in and help people imagine how it could be different. And so that kind of is like, oh, wait, I've become this radical activist. How does the art fit in? Oh, there are these other people that have done that, and let me try and do that with my art.
Yeah, sort of discovering and falling into a legacy, even a tradition of creative vision makers. Yeah. So many of your works, if folks are familiar previously or even from what we just saw, are, you could say, confrontational. I've heard you refer to yourself as a professional or full-time troublemaker. Professional troublemaker. Well, if you get paid to be a troublemaker, full-time,
I do get paid to be a troublemaker.
Yeah. And even the titles of your work are provocative, to say the least. The ones you've named, The Proper Way. What is the proper way to display a U.S. flag?
It's just a question.
Yeah.
It's just a question. That's not provocative. It's just a question.
Okay. I'll read some more. A man was lynched by police yesterday.
Okay.
Just a statement of fact. Okay.
Yes, yeah.
The burning of the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, okay.
White people can't be trusted with power.
Okay.
On the impossibility of freedom in a country founded on slavery and genocide.
Okay.
Yeah. And what I'm curious about is I want to add your name, Dred Scott, to that list of provocative titles.
Yeah.
Right? The title you gave yourself, your choice to embody and bring Dred Scott into every space you're in. I also want to say on our prep call with library folks last week, just what it did to me to hear folks say the name Dred Scott in what you said earlier about bringing the past to collide with our present. I had such a visceral experience of that in that call, of hearing folks say the name on a Zoom call about an event next week. Anyway, but so I wonder if you could talk Dred Scott, about Dred Scott, not just who he was and why you've taken on his name, but it feels to me like maybe your longest running performance art piece, like what the experience has been of bringing him into every space you enter.
Okay, yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, it does.
Yeah.
And so, partially getting back to my earlier, when you're 18, you don't know anything. You also don't know that much when you're like 22 or 21 or so. And so, as I said, I kind of grew up in punk rock, kind of. And so I knew people that were named, Joe Strummer, but also like Joey Shithead and Lee Ving. And I wanted a professional name, even though I wasn't, I was a worse musician than I was a student, but I knew I was a good artist. And so I said, I should have a stage name. And so, I had dreadlocks at the time, and my parents had named me Scott. And all the Dreds I knew were like Jimmy Dredd or Steve Dredd. And I'm like, wait, I'll be Dred Scott. That's perfect. Because both I have dreads, but also it references this particular case, which I'm sure most people in the audience know, but the Dred Scott decision. And that is a case, a Supreme Court case that in 1857, the Supreme Court ruled in Dred Scott versus Sanford that Dred, the historic enslaved man who sued for his freedom, had no rights that basically Dred Scott, but the black people had no rights that a white man was bound to respect. And that's almost a verbatim quote from the decision. And in reading the decision, which I did after I took the name, I knew that basic point, and I wanted people to think about that whenever they heard the name, and also the concept of dread and fear, but also reading that case, it is the most well-articulated, thought-out argument for white supremacy that I've ever read. Now, obviously, I don't agree with that, but it's 41 pages, rooted in the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and U.S. and U.K. law and custom up till that point. And the Chief Justice Taney, who wrote the decision, basically, did not think that black people were either citizens or basically human beings. And that he was arguing very vociferously, not even just for legal scholars, but also it was one of the most widely it is probably the most widely circulated to this date Supreme Court ruling, but at the time it was published and intended to be read by the public. It was an argument for, look, the founding fathers, which he quoted very directly, did not think of black people as citizens and even humans, and it's up to us to do whatever we want with them. And more than that, to say, look, if he thought of them if the founding fathers thought of black people or African descendant people as citizens, then they would be able to own guns. And they might use them against us. So clearly they did not think about that as citizens. They did not think of them as citizens. And it's a very open, look, we have a dictatorship of the monopoly of armed might against these people. And that is oh yeah, that's America. So bringing that history into our present is, very clear and increasingly relevant today. And so, yeah. And then as far as other titles of my works, I think that, some of it is just statement of fact or question. What is the proper way to display a U.S. flag? It is literally a question. Or imagine a world without America. That's a statement and just encouraging an audience to do things. And then things like burning the U.S. Constitution or white people can't be trusted with power. Those are a little bit more provocative. But, it's... I think the thing is, this is a profoundly polarized society, and not in world even, and not just between Republicans and Democrats, which is very apparent right now, but principally between the tiny handful of people that control the wealth and knowledge, and the broader humanity as a whole that creates that wealth and knowledge, and that polarization is causing tremendous suffering and wars and pain and I want to talk about that world and talk about it in a way that hopefully people see their world reflected in it, but also people can imagine a way out of it and a way forward. To be part of, if you suddenly see, wait, the police killing people they're the successors of lynch mob terror, you see something different than if just the police are shooting us down, or why are they doing this, or it's a few bad apples. It's oh, there's a continuum here, and I know something about the past, and I know something about the present, and maybe this is unreformable. Maybe we have to, we talked about this being the 250th anniversary of America. Maybe it's time to call an end on this experiment, but in a different way than Trump and people are trying to call an end on this experiment. They're trying to end democracy for a certain specific fascist reason. And I'm saying, well, look, a country that was founded on slavery and genocide, 2016 wasn't that good. Let's not return to that. Let's escape forward.
Yeah. It makes me think about what you said in the beginning about falling into the how you came to the arts and found it to be a space that supported and embraced and pushed your creative visioning, your outsiderness, your troublemakerness, and the way you talk about your work, you're like a creative historian or a visionary historian, or this idea of this commitment to having the past collide with the present to illuminate things, so it isn't just, as you say, a few bad apples or whatever, but the continuation of a legacy, and using art to wake us up to that in very arresting ways often. So of course, on the eve of Juneteenth, we can't not dive into the slave rebellion reenactment. I would just love to hear you talk more about that. Personally, I'm particularly interested in the community engaged aspect of it, and this notion that, it's not a performance, not a play. We're not hiring actors, rehearsing and memorizing a script and performing it, but that the conceit that getting community folk, regular folk, to engage in this process with you does something, right? To us, to history, to the land we walk on, right? This conviction that the art experience of community coming together for a couple of years, I think the process was, does something. It's transformational, is the conceit. So I would love to just hear more about who were these hundreds of people, what was that process, what happened? And you were in there too, at the front of the line. What did it do to you?
So the first thing on history and historian, I'm not a historian. I study history, but I'm not a historian. I have a tremendous respect for those that are both art historians, but historians. I mean, in fact, actually, it's great being in Boston and because a couple of the key historians that helped out with slave rebellion reenactment were Vincent Brown, who's at Harvard, and Walter Johnson, who's also at Harvard.
Oh, wonderful.
And they really, the project wasn't about slavery, but I had to study slavery in order to do the project. And so they're both writing, but also just conversations with them really helped me to understand the ground that I was walking on and that was going to collide with our present. And so, and the community engaged aspect, I mean, the spectacle that the audience saw was potentially 2 days. And it was great, it was important, and it provided really interesting images. But the project was a multi-year project. I was working on it for about 7 years. That included development, fundraising, conception. As I said, I'm not from New Orleans, and I knew after about 3 months into the project, I knew that it needed to be this specific rebellion, and so I started going down to New Orleans and meeting people and learning from them, both the people who kept that history. The history of that rebellion is largely unearthed by people's historians. There was a man named Leon Waters, who, along with a man named Albert Thrasher, but Leon particularly had family history. He had basically an aunt, but she was technically a cousin of his, who, when he was very young, told him, hey, our ancestors fought against slavery. And he was 10 at the time, or 12, and he's like, what do you do with that? But then he did research when he got older, and it was just, he's not a historian, he's an activist. They published this history, and so I wanted to meet him, but also some of the people who brought this history. They self-published a book in 1995 of the largest rebellion of enslaved people in U.S. history that until that time, nobody really knew anything about. There was, up until then, there were only 20 scholarly pages written on this amazing event. And so, it's like, what does that say about what other slave revolts there were that we don't know about? Because that's not the history that's told. And so in wanting to do this, I quickly came to the understanding you cannot understand the history of the modern world, or specifically the United States, without understanding the history of slavery. But you also couldn't understand the history of slavery if you didn't understand the history of slave rebellions and slave revolts. That otherwise you have this, there's this, mythology, slaves were happy. And it's like, no, why would slaves have been happy? Did anybody ever say, the Jews in Auschwitz were happy? That would be ridiculous to say that. But it was a mythology that I even heard when I was doing this from people that actually knew and liked me. They were not overt racists, but they said, I thought the slaves were happy. Well, why do you think that? Why would anybody think that for a second? But there's been a lot of work to get people to think that. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to go into this history that is, foundational to understanding our modern world. That, there were over 250 examples of 10 or more people in the United States during the times of enslavement having rebellions. And there were 10% of transatlantic slave trades, the Middle Passage, 10% of those ships had rebellions and mutinies on them. That's not a history that people broadly know. Well, what would that change about how you think of the foundation of this country if you knew that? What would how would you think about the world, and how would people who are descendants of enslaved people think about themselves if they knew, wait, we were not slaves, we're the descendants of people that were enslaved, and the reason that we're in our position today is because of all the resistance and the people who fought back. And so that community engaged standpoint of people wanting to discover and get into this history and think about how it affects them in the present and build community. And so it was not me as you said, it wasn't me hiring a bunch of actors, it was me going out to that community and talking with people, having one-on-one conversations with people about why they might want to reenact this history, a 19th century history of freedom and emancipation, dressed up in some funny 19th century costumes, walking through a racist part of the country, Klan country, where people fly the Confederate flag as they walk around with their AR-15 and they burn down churches. So let's go to that area and do a slave rebellion reenactment. And people talking about that and figuring out how to embody freedom and emancipation, and then those people sort of mirroring the structures of how in 1811 there was a man named Charles Dillon who went from plantation to plantation to recruit people who became his lieutenants, and those people then in turn talked to people on their plantation who should know about it and kept the information away from people who shouldn't know about it. We mirrored that structure. So I recruited about 40 to 50 people, and those people in turn found the people that should participate and wanted to participate in one-on-one conversations. So it really was a multi-year project. Some people participated for as long as 6 years, some people for 6 days. But really trying to build this army of the enslaved, even though it was a public project with websites and funding and permits and all that stuff. How the Army of the Enslaved was built was actually clandestine. It wasn't built online. It wasn't built, by people sending out emails or Instagram posts. It was built by people having one-on-one conversation with the people they thought should participate, and then all sort of coming out of nowhere almost to do this rebellion. And then those networks of people who came together both beforehand but also on the couple days itself, sometimes remaining intact, of people figuring out how, now that they've thought about this history of freedom and emancipation, of people who had no way to get free except by overthrowing the system of enslavement, which would have been difficult. Most slave revolts failed. The one that was really successful was Haiti, but most of them were destined to failure. Some were doomed to fail even before they got off the ground and were just glorious, but nonetheless doomed. This was not predetermined that it would fail, but it didn't succeed in establishing an African republic in the New World, which was their goal. It didn't succeed in that, but it was something that was a really inspiring vision. But nonetheless, it would have, even people who participated, that would have been really difficult. How do you actually overthrow the armed might of the precursor of the Marines, the Dragoons, the planters' militia, the state overall, the governors, the newly formed U.S. And how do you do that and keep your family and friends alive through that process and risk everything to actually get free? And so what does that vision of the problem is slavery, the solution is ending enslavement, what does that mean for people today? Because right now, people's political sights are very low. And I'm not even talking right now under Donald Trump. I'm talking in 2018, 2019. A lot of times people's hope was, well, maybe if we can get one more Democrat in the Senate or something. It's like, that's not how these enslaved people figured it. They weren't thinking, let's form a super PAC and end slavery. They were like, we have to overthrow the system of enslavement. It's difficult, it's risky. Let's figure out the plans to do that. And so then how do modern day people take that into their daily lives?
There's like 3 questions that are fighting in my head about which one is going to be asked. I think I'll end with asking about vision, this idea of vision. And there's a lot in your work that is confrontational. There's a lot in your work that's about having the past collide with the present. And then there's also works that are the result of radical imagination and inviting us into radical imagination, right? Whether it's Imagine a World Without America, whether it's the consulate piece, even the Jenny piece that you showed earlier, Pirate Jenny piece, which maybe you want to say more about, but my understanding of it from seeing it before is that one of the invitations there is to imagine that the freedom fighters might be anywhere among us. We might be surprised about where the resistance might come. But I wonder if you could talk about that, this idea of radical imagination and the vision that we need to get us where we hope to go, right?
So that's a really good question.
Yay!
And part of what, so, you know, a lot of times when we think of political art,
Yeah.
a lot of times it's art that's condemning the horrors that are now. And a lot of that work's really important. You think of Picasso's Guernica, you know, it's an artwork about fascist bombing of a civilian population. Or you think of Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, a very powerful condemnation of lynching at the time when lynching was still a real big thing, and it was attracting a huge Black audience, but also getting her hounded by the FBI and others. A very courageous song, very important. There's a lot of, I mean, most political work is really in this tradition of saying this is what's wrong in the world, and that work is really important. I hope that I've made some of it, and that's where a lot of it, but this other thing of how do people get free? What is a vision for the future? There's also work that's been like that, but it's rarer and it's sometimes harder to make. I mean, there's work like Jacob Lawrence did a whole series of Saint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution, as well as John Brown and Harriet Tubman. So there's work that's like that. And then, you know, talking about Pirate Jenny, it's a song that Nina Simone did. So there was a suite of paintings that I did that were inspired by Nina Simone. And the first one was about a song called I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free. But Pirate Jenny is an interesting one. It's actually from Bertolt Brecht and Oscar Wilde musical, The Threepenny Opera. So Nina didn't write the song, but it is, the way she does it has a very particular resonance in an American context, and it describes sort of a maid, a barmaid, basically, Jenny, who is disrespected and harassed and somewhat assaulted by the people at the inn. And she has this inner life of wanting this pirate army to come and destroy the town that she's in, and then she sails away with the pirates. And I kind of imagine that with a mind, so she, and when Nina Simone does it, there's both a lot of bitterness in it, but also it has a very, I mean, she doesn't change the lyrics at all, but it has a very specific American and American South context to it. You can really see this really pissed off Black, you know, working girl who just has to put up with all the crap that poor Black women have to put up with in this society, and wanting to kill all the people that have assaulted and disrespected her daily. And imagine getting free that way, and imagine that there's an army that will help rescue her that she leads. And so I thought about, well, what if that gets updated a little bit? What if she's a barista or something like that? And what if part of her army are the people that were rising up around George Floyd and burning police cars and coming to get rid of an entire system that plagues people in general, but specifically Black women. And you know, I mean, one of the things that, you know, I think is important to think about, it's like in America, a lot of change agents, including, you know, in the civil rights movement, including the Black Power movement, were women. They don't get a lot of the credit that, you know, Martin Luther King gets, or Bayard Rustin, or W.B. Du Bois, but, you know, and those movements wouldn't have been what they were without the Black women who are important, and particularly now a lot of people, but a lot of Black dudes don't have the time and patience to throw down and make change. It's a lot of the women, a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement. That's been women. I mean, it's and a lot of the theorizing, even including just the concepts of intersectionality. I mean, that's women. It's like and so it's in slave rebellion reenactment, 70% of the army of the enslaved was women. That's who could be bothered to do this weird performance. It didn't have to be that way, but those are the people that came forward. A lot of the 18 to 25-year-old dudes, I guess they were playing video games or football, don't know what they were doing, but that wasn't as important to them. But the women were like, hell yeah, if we can go up against, these all the white supremacy with some antiquated weapons and get free, I'm about that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I so appreciate artists, you and artists like you, who are, as you said, not just critiquing, pointing to the problems, but inviting us into this space of radical imagination. And there's two quotes that are humming in my brain right now. One is from a late artist, Sekou Sundiata, who said, we know imagination alone can't solve real world problems, but real world problems cannot be solved without it. And the great historian of social movements, Robin Kelley, and all that he's researched as a scholar around social movements and how change happens, he says, ultimately, imagination is the portal, and artists must lead the way. Just how important this revolutionary visionary art is in leading the way and inspiring us all. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And so, in our remaining moments, what do you want to know? What are your questions?
Did you have any artistic primary documents for the costumes that people were wearing?
Yeah, so this was in Slave Rebellion reenactment, it was a very big socially engaged project. We had a costume department. And one of the things in conducting the research, we had to, if you just ask people what did enslaved people wear, most people weren't thinking about it, but then people think, cheap clothing, burlap sacks or whatever, and that wasn't true. So we looked at historic paintings and drawings, and we quickly figured out that the ones from the time in the United States were already depicting Black people in racist tropes, so those weren't very useful to us. So we looked at things from the French Atlantic world, Saint-Domingue, Haiti, Guadeloupe, and the lithographs and etchings and paintings from there to kind of develop the costumes, because those just seemed to be more, for lack of a better word, documentary. And it's not that the French weren't racist in the places where they enslaved people, but the visual culture wasn't about demeaning people the same way. And so then looking at those, we realized, you'd see pictures of men with turbans, for example. It's like, yes, they're coming from West Africa. One of the ways to stay cool when you work is to have turbans. And we also realized, the fashion designers and seamstresses of the day would have been West Africans. And so, it's like, and then we read various things about, most of the clothing was relatively inexpensive clothing, but there was even division. It was both very regionally specific. So what people might have worn in North Carolina might have been different than what they wore in New Orleans. And part of the split was whether it was sort of British colonialism or French colonialism. That was part of the difference, which actually somewhat reflected the clothing traditions of those regions. But even we wanted to do the costuming in a way that gave enslaved people back their humanity. And so all of the people in this room probably bought their clothing at about the same time. We perhaps are a little bit more formally dressed than most of y'all, but even within us, the clothing is similar but not the same, and your clothing is similar but not the same. Well, with enslaved people, they weren't going down to the five and dime and, hey, can we get 200 worker uniforms? I mean, there was some of that, but it mostly wasn't that. And so we wanted to actually, people when seeing this wanted to say, oh wait, these were individuals that might have, plantation A might have had a different seamstress than plantation B, or if you keep your clothing for 3 or 4 years, it might be different than the new one that you get, or something like that. And the sensibilities of where people, whether they were coming from, Senegambia or whether they were coming from Dahomey, might be a different set of design ideas about what is fashion. So we did look a lot at what was in the past, and then we, created from that. And then also, honestly, we gave kind of a style guide, but then people made some of their own costumes, and then they brought their own sensibility to it in some cases. Yeah, so.
Oh, yeah.
Hi. Lovely to get to see you in person. Thank you for being here. I was wondering, your works that are dealing directly with the American flag,
Yeah.
how do you see those works in conversation with works also engaging with the flag, like Faith Ringgold's work or David Hammond's work, that kind of thing?
Okay, so Faith Ringgold, David Hammond's gods. And for those who don't know, they're really important African-American artists. Faith just passed recently. David is still, as far as I know, on the planet, although I'm not sure he was ever really on the planet. So really, I started doing works on the American flag in 1987, and was just using it initially as a symbol to talk about America, and using it to talk about some of the crimes that I saw that America was committing. And then after I did that, I started to look to see what other artists were doing that a little bit, but that was sort of haphazard. I was a young artist. I wasn't really looking at the visual arts. And then I was lucky enough to have this class where a poor, unfortunate TA was assigned to talk about Faith Ringgold. And the reason I say it was unfortunate was art history is rooted in a Germanic tradition. The Germans were sort of the first to systematize art history the way we understand it today. So a lot of the texts are written in German. And so Faith Ringgold has this really wonderful piece that this TA, who probably got a bunch of slides from her professor and told, go pull these slides and show them, and they were showing a range of them. And she's proceeding to talk about this piece that the subtitle is, I can't remember the title or the subtitle is Flag for the Moon. But the person proceeded to talk about the piece as Die Niger. And actually that would be a perfectly acceptable German pronunciation of the text that's on the flag, which is blocking out the stars and stripes in a particular way, but it actually says Die Nigger. And so I'm seeing this and thinking, I don't think she's got this right. But it was really great for me to see this. It's like, oh, other artists have used the flag, and this is the powerful things you can do with it. Because until that time, I didn't know who Faith Ringgold was. And so, I'm 65 years old. Or sorry, I'm 60 years old, born in 1965. And so when I went to school, there wasn't a lot of conversations about Black artists or progressive political artists. So nobody really told me about David Hammond's or Faith Ringgold or Glenn Ligon, who's basically a contemporary of mine. Carrie Mae Weems, basically a contemporary. People who you would just know if you went to art history, again, an art education today. I didn't know. So when I discovered people like Roy de Carava or Leon Golub or Hans Hacke, it was like finding oxygen, but I had to kind of find that myself. And so seeing Faith Ringgold was like, wow, this is really great. I was so happy, even though the TA totally screwed up. It was really great to do that. And then David Hammond, I honestly didn't discover until much later. I mean, the first work of Hammond's that I knew where he used the American flag was after my "What is the proper way to display a U.S. flag" got controversial. He did a piece called the African American flag, which is basically a red, black, and green version of the American flag, which he did in 1990, which my suspicion is he probably saw my work and did that somewhat in response, but he'd been using the American flag since 1967 or 65 even maybe. I mean, David's a really brilliant conceptual artist, and I think one of the best political works ever is this piece that he did that was there was a trial called the Chicago 8 trial, which was protesters at the Democratic National Convention in 1968 got arrested for complicated reasons. Bobby Seale, who was not really one of the protesters, but he was a leader of the Black Panther Party, also got arrested, and he was originally part of the same trial as the other people, including Abby Hoffman and others. But then he got severed from the case, so it became the Chicago 7 trial. But anyway, he, at his trial, was protesting that he couldn't have his own lawyer, and the judge had him literally bound and gagged in his trial. And so David Hammons did this. Yeah, I mean, there's actually a kind of decent popular movie that came out called the Chicago 8, I think, that was out like about 5 or 6 years ago. It's actually a pretty good movie. But anyway, so David Hammons does this piece right at the time of the trial, or maybe a couple months later, of a body print that's like a profile. So he's like got Bobby Seale sitting, or a person himself actually, sitting in a chair like this with American flag tied around his arm and gagging his mouth. That comes out right at the time. It's a really brilliant piece. Again, I didn't know that work until years later, but it's really great to know there's this profound tradition of radical artists, including a lot of radical Black artists who've used the American flag. And I'm happy to kind of be part of that tradition, even though a lot of it, when I was doing most of that work, I was very ignorant of.
Another artist, by the way, who sadly died a few years ago, John Sims, did a lot of work with the Confederate flag. Proper way to hang a Confederate flag, etc. But one of the things I think is so important about your work is it makes people wake up and think differently. And I wonder if you've thought about doing anything on one of the, I think Angela Davis said, the moral litmus test of our time, and that is the United States-Israeli genocide that is raining down on the Palestinians. And I wonder, it's been going on for 100 years, but it's exploded right now. And I wonder what you might think of doing, given the way you think of things.
Yeah. Well, first off, thanks for bringing up John Sims. John was a friend, and if you guys don't know John's work, you should look him up. He's not super well known, but was a really good guy. The picture of me burning flags on the steps of the Capitol, I'm wrapped in a keffiyeh. And, that was from 1989. And, the first Intifada was happening at the time, and I was really inspired by people who were taking on colonial occupation and oppression with just rocks. They were standing up to people with guns and planes with just rocks. And that was heroic and inspiring. And I haven't, some of the works from the same project, what is the proper way to display a U.S. flag, as part of, do have images of Palestinians fighting. I mean, it's not specifically about Palestine, but it uses some of those images. And there was a project I did after Hurricane Katrina called Never Forgive, Never Forget, They Left Us to Die, which recreates sort of what are called martyrs posters that Palestinians use to commemorate their dead, but also to fight to get free. And so I was inspired by the fact that people sometimes, freedom fighters of varying stripes, sometimes just people that got killed by Israeli forces, were memorialized, and that their deaths were going to be used to help people get free. And so I used that, the styles of those posters to talk about the people that died in the storm. But I think it's really important to make work now, and I'm trying to figure out how to do that. I mean, just literally about a week ago, I was doing some body prints actually using keffiyehs, but it's not, you know, we're in the midst of a genocide. It's being live streamed, and you know, it is sort of soul crushing if you're paying attention to see an entire population starved and even shot at when they're just trying to get food, and hospitals bombed and journalists killed, and you know, children targeted, children who are on the phone screaming because their family's just been killed, and then having Israeli snipers, you know, shoot them in their van, and then having people who protest that halfway around the world, including at, you know, Harvard and Yale and Columbia and MIT and other places, you know, in NYU being, you know, sort of persecuted and prosecuted for standing up. And so it's really important to make work, but it's difficult to make work that is not trivializing this, and that is good, and especially at a time when, you know, people who run important art spaces and funding circles are punishing artists if you dare to speak up. I mean, the Whitney Museum just canceled, frankly, an entire program that they had. There's a program called the Whitney Independent Study Program that basically first or second year grad students or people sometimes after grad school went to this program, and it was somewhat a radical or progressive program, which, full disclosure, I went to and was part of in 92 and 93. But they basically have artists and curators come, and they spend a year in the program, and then at the end of the program, the artists put on an exhibition, and the curators and historians also mount an exhibition that they curate. And one artist that was going to be in the performance series, about 4 months earlier, presented a project and said something basically provocative about whether the audience supported Palestinian rights and whether they loved Palestinians. And the Whitney used that as an excuse to cancel this performance. So something that they said 4 months earlier supposedly violated the Whitney's zero tolerance policy. And so they censored the show, but then they canceled the whole Whitney Independent Study Program, which had been running for 57 years. There are ways in which people are being defunded. And, you know, there's this thing which you guys may know about called the Canary List, which is basically a doxing, and it's a blacklist that is sort of run by Israeli intelligence and funded by billionaires, including American billionaires. And I am on that list. But it mostly is targeting students and basically saying these people should never be allowed to eat if they've criticized Israel. And that's the short version of what it is. And, you know, museums and funders have sort of seen, oh yeah, we should do the bidding of fascist governments and Israeli occupation forces to limit anybody criticizing Israel. And, you know, that is pervasive in the art world. And so that's not what's stopping me, but it is something that if I make this work, where will it show is a question. Because museums know, well, our funding is going to get cut, curators may get fired. And so it's, you know, the biggest question is how to make work that's up to the times, but then there's the question of just if I make it and it sits in my studio, it's not doing anybody any good. And there are very real concerns of if a curator decided to show it, would that curator continue to have a job? Would that museum get closed down? Would funders, you know, would patrons intentionally never buy my work again? You know, which, you know, if that's the price I pay, it's very different and far lower cost than being shot at and sniped at, which is what's happening in Israel. But, you know, it's a challenging time to make work about this question when people in the West and specifically America have decided that genocide is okay.
Hi, my name's Cole. I'm a local Boston artist, and similar to what you were just saying, how the times are, it's very hard to like make art in such unprecedented times or repeated unprecedented times. I was wondering, what does practicing joy look like for you as a living Black artist in these times, and what art advice do you have for fellow Black political artists?
Main advice is do better than me. We got to get free. We're not free yet, and I've been fighting as best I could, but we're still in a messed up situation. And you know, joy. I mean, it's a good question, and I'm trying to learn. You know, the Slave Rebellion reenactment. You know, when we did it, it was the most free space I'd ever been in my life. It was something that worked way beyond my wildest dreams. And part of why the project worked was it wasn't my project, but it was a collective project that people, none of us quite knew what we were getting into. I created a framework that I hoped would be good and enable people to embody freedom and emancipation and joy. But none of us really, it hadn't been done before. And it was the coming together of people making it their own, not my project, but our project, that made it as powerful as it could be. I think, actually, I think there, I have footage, and I think there's a video on the Guardian's, the UK newspaper, the Guardian's website that's linked on my website. If you want to look at my website, there's a link to it. It might not be, the footage I'm looking for might not be, but there's a point where people are just dancing and singing in just this profound, joyous way. It was unscripted. It was people just doing that. And, you know, that, you know, it's really linked with freedom, because if it's just people denying the present horrific situation, then it's illusory. And I'm all for people having fun. You know, it's like a lot of the music I like, you know, has a real edge to it, but there's, you know, people got to shake that ass sometime. You got to get out on the dance floor and just have fun. And, you know, there's a place for music and culture like that. You know, there's also a place for fighting the power and so, you know, but there's, for too long, and in my thinking, too much exclusive emphasis on fighting the power and not enough on paying attention to what I actually like in terms of at least the musical culture as well as even the visual culture. And I've tried to make work that is, I mean, I've always thought my work should be beautiful or something. I mean, coming out of a tradition of more conceptual and postmodern art, a lot of that stuff is terrible to look at. It's boring. I mean, it is. It's off-putting. It's not fun. And I never wanted to do that. I did always think about sort of beauty in some way, but joy is a little different. And it's actually because of younger people mostly who've been saying, look, we're not just about, you know, either being shot by cops or fighting against cops. There's a point of having fun. And that's something that I'm, as an older person, you know, trying to learn from. And I think I've done it in a couple projects. I mean, I do think Slave Rebellion reenactment was the height of it, but I think there's actually a lot of joy in All Africans People's Council. We were all kind of in on the joke, and it was really great. And you know, there are other projects. I've got a project that was done in 2020 that is it's a picture of the Capitol, kind of. I mean, basically that is all dark with what looks like almost flames around it, and it's black and white, and it's the flames and drawings of the smoke and fire is all done with American flag ashes. That's the charcoal. And the project, the title is "We Don't Need No Water, Let the Motherfucker Burn." And so there's joy in that. But it's before, it was before the insurrection, but it took like a whole different context when Trump and his crew decided to do that. Joy is important, but it's an ongoing conversation. And again, to advice, I think part of the thing is be fearless, and that's easier said than done. But I think on that basis of not ignoring the horror that we live in, but actually having the courageous viewpoint of standing up to it and knowing that if you are fearless, you will find other people that are also courageous. And I say that because that's a place where you can look at, well, what art is really inspiring to me in my community? What is needed to get free? And there's a lot of really great work out there, including in the visual arts. But when I was young, I was more inspired by Toni Morrison and Oscar Brown Jr. and The Clash than I was by most of the visual art I was finding. It took a while to find visual art that I really liked, and there is a lot of it. There is a lot of really interesting visual art now, but there's a lot of ancestors, including living ancestors, to look at, and find the people that sort of speak to you and then do better than us.
If you could join me in thanking Dred Scott and Lizzie Davis. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.